Michael Lane. I'm the president of Liftport Group. We've been doing these space commercialization podcasts since about October, so coming pretty steadily up towards a year. So pretty happy about that. We do this Mondays and Wednesdays for our Dare Greatly show, and on Tuesdays we host either the Mars Society with their Red Planet Live show once a month, or the Space Frontier Foundation's Pioneers of Space Commercialization series, and that goes 3 times a month. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 5 o'clock, we've got a show going. So pretty happy about that. I really want folks to try to catch the show that we did yesterday with, it's the number 2 person at NASA, Deputy Administrator Lori Garver, retired, was our guest for the Pioneers show. And she really talked a lot about some of the eras she took as a pioneer. She was one of the folks leading the fight for the commercialization of space. It's a fantastic interview. I definitely want you to catch it. You can find that at youtube.com/liftport, and we'll have it up on our Spotify channel pretty soon. You want to take a look for Dare Greatly Space. There are several Dare Greatly shows within Spotify. You want to look for the Dare Greatly Space one. When we do these shows, we kind of have 3 formats. We have a deep dive into a document. We do a news review, and our favorite kind of show is the show that we're having tonight. We have a guest. So that's what we're going to do tonight. I'll bring in our guest here in a moment. And then the way that we do this show is kind of we talk about that intersection, that conjunction point between commercialization, money, and infrastructure. So how do we get out into space and do all the things that we want to do? So those are our shows. We've got a heck of a catalog now, almost 40 on Spotify, almost 60 on our YouTube channel. That's not including all the stuff that we did during the pandemic, where we were hosting 27 online conferences as a service. And that's actually how I met our guest tonight. So we're going to kind of resurrect some of the history there. Dr. Ziarnick has been on our program twice. He was on our very, very first show. So we're going to rehash some of the things that we've learned since then. Before we do, I'm going to share just a couple snippets of news. I'm not going to do any big analysis. I'm just going to showcase them and move on. Just a moment. So the Space Foundation is one of the largest organizations in the field. They have been doing annual reports going back to 2006. They've been in the business of investigating the space sector since, I think, 1983 or 1993. 1983. They just came out with their most recent report. The new number, we all knew it was coming, a global space economy of $546 billion. Now keep that in mind, because just last week we reviewed the report from Space Capital and Space Angels, and only $280 billion has gone into this industry. 280 private dollars have gone into this industry. And last year, the space report came out with $484 billion as the space economy was $484 billion, and this year it's $546 billion. They anticipate that will be north of $800 billion within the next 5 years. So Pretty interesting, definitely worth grabbing. This is a $250 report. I did not buy it, so it's up to you if you want to do that, but follow these links. I'm going to post them in the chat in a moment. And then this article from Dr. Hanlon and Rand Simberg. If you're going to the South Pole, actually go to the South Pole. And it's a pretty strong argument about, don't go messing with the historic sites. There was an op-ed about returning to Tranquility Base. That is a terrible idea for a lot of reasons. One of them is the historic elements of it. So I 100% support Hanlon and Simberg on this. So I'm going to post that article. Definitely worth reading. This one is a little surprising. Oops. Believe it or not, the golden record that Carl Sagan put together and is now the farthest object humans have ever built. It's going outside of our solar system. It's on the Voyager crafts. This thing's for sale. The Master, the original is for sale. Anticipated going for $300,000 to $600,000. Leah on my team suggested that some of the wealthy Silicon Valley folks pick this up. She's got Jurvetson in mind in particular, but whether this is a museum or it's available for other people to see in the world, I think it's an artifact that we need to make sure remains visible and public. I hope. This next one surprises me a little bit. The Pew Center has been doing evaluations on the space sector, well, across, not just the space sector, all sorts of research topics. They're pretty well known for being reasonably unbiased in their reporting. Curiously, they issued their report on July 20th. Make sure everybody knows July 20th is the anniversary of landing on the moon for the first time. So they came up with this report, and it's pretty interesting. They talk about how the American public is really kind of starting to embrace the private companies. By the way, this is not just a small group. This is a survey of 10,000 people. There are some kind of interesting findings. Yes, America should be leading in the international efforts to go to space. They're relatively comfortable with the commercialization. Some people, a smaller group, actually think that we can do this space exploration and development without NASA. Now, I want to caution you, this report doesn't talk about development. They are only talking about exploration, which is, I think, either an error on the part of the questionnaires or maybe it's a misstatement. So I'm a little curious about that part. This one kind of caught me way off guard. I'm just going to read it directly. Monitoring asteroids that could potentially hit the Earth ranks as the top of the public's priority list for NASA. Monitoring the planet's climate system also ranks as highly as a priority for NASA, but relatively few Americans say it should be a top priority to send human astronauts to the moon or Mars. So I'm really surprised by that. Of course, I want to see NASA monitoring the climate of the world. I think that's super important. But I was in DC on a campaign program, not a campaign like a political campaign, but as a private citizen on something called March Storm back in 2004 and 5, and we all wanted to start talking about monitoring asteroids, potentially deflecting asteroids. Nobody wanted to talk about that. So that's a big change in 20 years. I'm really surprised to see this lower priority about going to the moon and Mars. I'm very surprised by that. So interesting article, definitely worth reading. There is a full report here if you want to see the whole report. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up because I want to get over to our guest. Stop sharing. Hi, this is Dr. Brett Ziarnick. I'm so glad to see you again. It's been a couple of years. I'm glad to see you on the show.
No, thanks for having me. It's exciting. Hope everyone's having a good evening.
Yep. Okay, so let's set the stage a little bit. We always ask folks to kind of share their origin story. How did you get here? Where are you? And what got you to this point in the first place? So we're really kind of looking at your history. Go back as far as you want, but then like step by step, bring us to where you are now.
Oh wow! And we only have an hour.
Yeah.
Now,
let's focus in on 10-ish, 5-ish, 10-ish, 15-ish minutes. Let's figure out how deep we go.
No, that sounds good. Hi everyone. I probably really got excited about space when I was really young. My mom said that my first word was moon, and that might be true. But ultimately, I decided to go to the Air Force Academy, probably to try to be an astronaut, like a lot of people do. And I was able to get there. Turns out I really like space because when I was as a cadet, I saw the Rumsfeld Commission report when I was a little bit older. I think I was either, a sophomore or a junior at that time, but it's like, Space Force,
What years are we talking about? Your academy years?
Well, let's see, 2001. So I went to the academy 99 to 2003.
Okay.
So about 2001 is when they started getting into space. I wanted to be a military historian, sort of. That was what I was good at with a philosophy minor, but the Air Force said, "Hey, you like space, you have to be an astronautical engineer." So I saluted smartly, said, "Yes, sir." I could fake the math well enough, I guess.
We had the NASA historian on our show early in the year. Maybe it was January, maybe December. But Dr. Roger Lanius he was an Air Force guy. He was the historian for the Air Force for a long time, and then took up the role for NASA, and then went on to to be the curator administrator of the Smithsonian Institution. If you'd like a connection to Dr. Lanius, I'm happy to connect y'all if you're still interested in the history of things. He's a pretty fascinating guy. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll never say no. That sounds great. Thanks.
Great. Yeah.
But anyway, when I was going through school, flying was okay, but I really got excited about space. So I decided to go space missile as an operations officer. I thought Air Force Space Command was really neat. I think I saw one of their blue flight suits once. Only later did I found out they were their missile suits.
Okay.
But anyway, I did that fully expecting to be 30 years plus as a career. But when I was in 2 stops doing GPS work as a second lieutenant, I got to see the X Prize flights. So I forced my crew to watch the X Prize flights from Mojave, in Colorado Springs. Good. That's cool. I grew up in Chino, which is just across the mountains, really, from Lancaster. It's like as soon as I leave California, all the cool stuff happens. But at about that time, about a year or two afterwards, this is 2007, maybe 2 years, I guess. They decided to get rid of a lot of space people. We just had too many officers in our year group that were space operators. So I took the buyout essentially to join the reserves and go civilian in the hopes to get with the private space flight companies,
Okay.
and went down to New Mexico to see if I could get a job working at Spaceport America. And after a while, I did work for the New Mexico Spaceport Authority and
Oh, I
help
didn't know that.
design. Yeah, it was neat. I
Yeah.
got to help design the spaceport. We had a little bit of money, but not enough to build what I would consider the most robust airstrip that we wanted. But we're able to do that. I was fully convinced that in my backyard in 2008, I was going to be able to see people fly into space. You know, thankfully, 15 years later, they sort of have those flights going.
Right.
Not as many as we'd like, but they're going at least, which is really cool. But I did that for a while. Part time, I was getting my PhD in economics, working on spaceport economics, doing my reserve time. You know, I went from being a junior captain to a major. Then eventually got picked up to go to professional military education, Air Command and Staff College in Alabama, and did pretty well there. They noticed I had a PhD. They sent me to the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, which is the second year follow-on in Alabama for strategists, for Air Force strategists. It was neat. I was the first student that actually was able to lecture as well, because I lectured on my space book, which was neat. But after I got that, completed that year, I started teaching full-time as a military officer at Air Command and Staff College. I stood up the space concentration there.
Okay.
And
What years was that?
that was, by this time, it was about 2018. So I was jumping along, but yeah, I've got 5 minutes, right? So that was about the same time that the Space Force argument came out.
Right.
It was actually the Space Corps first around 2017.
Yes, should have stayed that way.
Yeah, we can discuss that a little bit later if you want. But I got picked up as a civilian, so I hung up my uniform, my active duty uniform again, went reserve while I was a civilian working on building the Schriever Scholars Space Concentration, which ultimately became Space Force Professional Military Education. While I got back in the reserve uniform, I was DO of the Director of Operations, pretty much second in command of a reserve unit doing space-based situational awareness. Then I did a little bit of command time as a squadron commander for the reserve space training unit, which was really neat. But then a little bit later, at 20 years, I retired from the reserve as a lieutenant colonel. That was like 3 months ago.
All right. Congratulations.
A long enough time to try to grow a beard, which isn't working too well. And the Space Force PME moved from Alabama to Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., their School for Advanced International Studies. So I am now a visiting professor, a visiting assistant professor. It might be a visiting associate professor. We're still not sure how that goes.
Okay.
But at Johns Hopkins, where I teach, the intermediate level Space Force PME, leadership in the space domain, and a little bit of modern warfare. It'll be pretty fun. But I'm a school teacher, essentially, teaching Space Force people and others, mid-level officers, majors, and the equivalent at a pretty top flight university, which if you asked me 20 years ago what I'd be doing, that was not high up.
That was not it. Right. That was not it.
So, I started out as an astronautical engineer. As a matter of fact, a space operations major, because they wouldn't let full-fledged engineers be operations officers in the early or in 2003, as far as the Space Force goes. Then got through my master's degree, and then, finally started to indulge my other, passions, economics, as weird as that sounds, in military history, but with a space bent. So I've been doing that ever since. So, I was given some advice that was halfway decent, but if you want to be a space person, you have to be technical. 20 years later, that is really not the case anymore.
Not at all.
It's very exciting.
You need to know the language, but you don't have to do the calculations. I think it's important that we all have kind of a common vocabulary. Let's dig into the PME though. Professional military education. Dial it back to its basics first, and then kind of be a little bit specific about who you're teaching and what you're teaching.
Well, in the military, especially the U.S. military, some people tend to think, especially academics tend to think, that military officers especially are not particularly well educated. And that's not really the case. Even 100, 200 years ago, people realized that you needed to teach your officer corps their profession, military affairs, and begin when they're young and continue that education through the senior ranks. Now, the modern professional military education that we have today sort of started in the late 1800s and sort of solidified between or among the professional or basic military education or basic level education, BLE, I guess you call it now, which is for the lieutenants and captains. Then intermediate level education, which would be for majors or lieutenant commanders, O4s. And then O5s and O6s would go to senior level education.
For those civilians, O5s and O6s is colonels and generals.
Lieutenant colonel and colonel, but they're on their way to general.
Right. Yeah.
With hope, right?
Right.
But so with the Space Force, they needed their own ability to do that, to learn space-specific things.
Right.
For many years, Air Force Space Command people went to the Air Force Air Command and Staff College, like I did, and like I taught there, and learned a lot about Air Force stuff, but not a whole lot about space. And that was part of the reason why Congressman Mike Rogers really wanted to start a Space Corps when he realized that you didn't get a whole lot of space education in the Air Force.
Right.
He might have over exaggerated that a little bit, but basically he was correct. So a lot of my, pretty much all my professional military education career, as far as teaching goes, is teaching space centric PME. So now that it's moved to Johns Hopkins, the Space Force has a very unique opportunity not to get the students don't have to get an Air University degree, an ACSC degree, or an Air War College degree. And people are like, what in the heck is a Master of Military Operational Art and Strategy?
Right.
I'm very proud of mine, but it's hard to explain.
Right.
Now they get a master's degree in public policy from Johns Hopkins, which is not something
pretty badass. Right? That's solid, right? Yeah.
So it is very exciting. And I think with the curriculum that Greg Miller, Dr. Greg Miller, the director, is setting up, and the rest of his staff, me included, have put together a very good program. And with electives from other Johns Hopkins professors and stuff like that, it's going to be an amazing program, and I'm very excited to be a part of it.
Outstanding. This is the first year it's offered?
It is. As a matter of fact, the first class of students showed up this week.
Ha! Awesome. That's terrific. That's terrific. We've had so my school's International Space University, which is no slouch also, but it's not the same, right? It's the only school that exclusively teaches space, but it's a wide, not deep education. And then just a few weeks ago, we've had him on a couple of times. Dr. Andy Aldrin, the son of Buzz Aldrin, runs the Embry-Riddle program. And we've had Dr. Greg Autry, who runs the Thunderbird program down in Arizona. So, we're a big fan of space education in all of its flavors, all of its facets. So let's talk about your new class, right? They're majors, right? So they're mid-career professionals. They haven't, I'm going to say at this point, they're kind of picking a specialization. Is that fair? Up until now, they've kind of been generalists.
Actually, it's sort of the opposite in that in the military, we talk tactical, operational, strategic as sort of the levels you go up.
Mhm.
And tactical folks, if you're talking about officers, the lieutenants and the captains get really good at their primary, mission, their primary satellite, really, at least when I was going through, where you were doing GPS or some sort of communication satellite, or if you're one of the cool kids, you had a space control satellite jammer, different things like that. You'd get one or two tours there, and then as you would go into major, that's when you would start doing your higher level staff tours, and you started to get a broader understanding of how all of your tactical things and all the other tactical stuff that the other captains that were doing fit into the bigger picture. And we do have two smaller, or at least sub programs, I should call them, at Johns Hopkins. Now we have the ILE program, which is for the majors, and we do have the SLE program for the lieutenant colonels and colonels. So uh, they're they're situated differently. They have different classes where the higher level class tends to be a little bit more strategic and broad, where the ILE, where I pretty much teach, is a little bit more operational. Although we have to keep, especially in my opinion, we have to keep the strategic and grand strategic vision of space open to everybody,
Right.
because especially the mid-level majors, in my opinion, because as they get senior leaders, they're going to have to confront the things that you all are doing, right?
Yeah.
The colonels might not have to, but the majors will,
Yeah.
if they stick around long enough.
Yep. I know one major in particular who is doing some interesting stuff over at National Reconnaissance Office, and boy, is he getting an interesting perspective of the world, right? They have to see the holistic picture to make good decisions, right? So, all right. So now you've got a bunch of it. It's not closed. It's available as a civilian also. Like you can go into that program as a civilian as well, right?
You can go into Johns Hopkins Master of International Public Policy, the SICE program, as a civilian, yes.
Yes.
And as a civilian, if you wanted to, you could take electives from the Space Force, cadre or professors or whatever you want to call us.
Yep.
That's part of our contract with the university, which is really cool. So I can't say that you can go through the entire program.
Right. There's probably some classification elements there.
If you want to, there's some significant overlap, and we look forward to it. Because the cool thing is too now, from the Johns Hopkins perspective, everything we teach by nature has to be unclassified now,
right? Yeah.
Which makes life so much easier.
Right. Yeah.
Because like, well, we could teach you in a closed, environment, but then we can't test you on it because that's talking out of school too, right? So this is much better. All the super classified stuff we can do somewhere else, not academic related.
Right. Because there's their academic career and then their real life profession. There's got to be like a handshake between those two roles in their lives. But yeah, you're not teaching in a skiff. You're not teaching in a controlled information environment. So, all right. So I kind of want to dig into, you're in a position. So let's go back in time. 3.5 years ago, we hosted a program that was looking at the difference of what is called blue water versus brown water thinking. Rather than me talk about that, I'd like you to talk about it. And I'm just going to tell everybody, spoiler alert, the blue side lost, right? The brown side won. So that was August. So almost exactly August, the end of August, maybe August 20th, 2020. So the pandemic was fully locked down in the world. Things were pretty spooky in some places. candidly, truth be told, our company almost went out of business, and doing these online conferences was the lifeline that kept us alive. So there were definitely some uncertain days ahead of us right then at that point. So we host this event. It's about 3 hours long. It's a bit of a debate. We bring in Dr. Townsend, Josh Carlson, you. Mosier didn't speak because that would have been kind of inappropriate. We brought in some folks from International Space University. General Quast was new. Not new. He was new on the scene, kind of in the public way. So he was there. A couple others. It was a pretty interesting event. So describe blue versus brown. Like ignoring all biases. What is it? What does it mean? And why should we care?
Well, there's a couple of different ways to explain it, but ultimately, blue versus brown water is a Navy term, right? So it was a sleight of hand that Space Force people had, or, truth be told, I did not like the idea of having a Space Force because of the name. It was too much like the Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, Air Force Space Command, which was essentially the Space Force before the Space Force happened, and it still is. The Space Force is Air Force Space Command writ large. Basically was a satellite command. They had a focus on building and operating satellites that focused what we would call on geo and below, which is everything that we had was focused on Earth. And if we did have something looking outside, towards other satellites, it was to protect other things that were focused on Earth. So it was a very much a belief that the military space forces were there to serve the interests of the terrestrial warfighting organizations on Earth, right? That by itself is not really wrong.
Right.
That's what the military bought and paid for. That's what they need: communications, GPS, all that other kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it was geo and below is what we refer to the brown water as. So why were they brown water? Because brown water navies are focused on brown water, which is interior rivers, the coasts. They were focused on helping land forces as much as possible.
So I'm a former U.S. Marine, and we only go in kind of brown water environments, right? We hit a beach, take a beach, right?
True.
We might be on a big ship, in the middle of the ocean, but we're not really doing anything there. We're only useful when we're close into shore. So that's the brown side. The blue side is deep water, submarines, aircraft carriers, right?
And really, if you want to get into it, it's power projection across your coasts, essentially. So I would say Marines aren't necessarily brown water if you're transported over the deep blue sea and you're used on South Pacific Islands or to, try to take Iwo Jima or Guadalcanal or something like that. So there's definitely overlap too, though, right?
Yeah.
So the blue water space forces, on the other hand, is what we called ourselves. It was Brigadier General Simon Warden, that came up with it, as near as we can remember.
Oh, really? He's the one who coined that?
He probably did, because we all got our marching orders from him.
Right.
Probably not like directly, but through some sort of weird psionic thing, I would guess. But
Warden's been on our show a couple times, and for those that don't know him, General Warden started out as a one-star general. He left the service. He went on to Arizona as a professor for a little while. He then went to NASA Ames. He was the director of NASA Ames Research Center for many years, maybe about a dozen years or so. And his most recent gig is he's a consultant to the Principality of Luxembourg and he helps run Breakthrough Starshot, which is an effort to go to another star. So hats off to General Warden. We all are, he's been leading this fight for a really long time.
So part of me is like, hey, that's great. It's great work if you can get it. The other one is, you're working for a foreign military power, sir? But I guess if Luxembourg takes over
the military, it's a little.
If Luxembourg takes over space, I guess, I'll have to get better at French or whatever they speak down there. No, I'm just kidding. But but when we were, our Space Force faction, the Blue Water folks said Blue Water, we essentially said, hey, we can't only look at Earth. We can't be myopically focused on only the ground. As one of the generals said, the Air Force Space Command generals who, said, if it doesn't happen on the ground, we're not interested.
Right.
That we didn't necessarily think that. It's like, look, you have to at least consider what's happening out in space. You have to consider the other actors in space. Mm-hmm. You don't just think about the military, the Space Force, as a joint force with the Army, Navy, Marine Corps. You have to think of it as a whole of government, maybe even a whole of nation force, which, supports the DoD, NASA, a lot of other different, Department of Education, Department of Commerce, you name it.
Yep.
So, effectively what was the difference between the Blue Water and the Brown Water is not a whole lot, except at the fringes, in that what the Blue Water folks really wanted was just to be able to think beyond just geo and below, and get that the official okay to actually start looking into these kind of things, to develop very modest, maybe even squadrons that would look at other things like that, and develop a cadre of younger folks that could function very easily in the commercial space industry and other things like that. Mm-hmm. So at least that's what we say to make ourselves sound better, right? But I
would go a little further. I don't just want folks who are willing to, looking and studying. I would want, as a commercial space guy, I think it's really important that y'all have a role out there to help us do what we're doing. And I would want, 5%, 7%, not even 10%, but, back in August 2020, I naively said 15%. And I've cut that straight in half, right? Sure. So look, 5%, 10%. Garrison calls that budget dust. Yeah, right. Like at the level that we're talking about, some amount of money that looks towards the moon. I mean, that's what I'm interested in, the Lagrange points and the moon. Because we do have competitor nations that are heading there, right?
Sure.
You just said, Warden's helping a foreign national government, a foreign government. But let's look at what he's doing, right? His role there is to talk about especially mining. Luxembourg is really focused on resource development, resource reclamation, and there's a piece out there about identifying rights of locations, specific rights.
He's trailblazing, and that nation is actually trailblazing a lot of different ideas.
They really are, but they're not the ones everybody should be concerned about, right? So if we know, and we know that China is going back to the moon, if we know, and we know it's a military-led mission, don't we have an obligation to minimally match it, let alone advance beyond it?
And I really like the fact that you said military, because I would agree with you. There's a military requirement to be out there. Mm-hmm. But the last sort of cultural divide is probably the largest one between the Blue Water and the Brown Water schools, is that the Brown Water wanted to have a space force that was like the Air Force, that that developed its mantra and its culture from war fighting, from
Right.
satellite fighting, and supporting the ground campaigns. But really, their big mantra is orbital warfare. I guess I worked on that kind of stuff. I'm not entirely certain that the way it's going to go down the way they think it is, but that's okay. But they were focused on having an independent combat effect, the forward-leaning ones, the forward thinker of the Brownwater, to be a fellow armed service of the joint, war fighting community.
Right.
The Blue Water people, on the other hand, wanted to have the cultural touchstone not to be a war-fighting organization like the Air Force, but more of a military organization that was non-war fighting, that was modeled mostly after the U.S. Coast Guard. And oddly enough, even though we were not very large in Air Force Space Command, we could explain what the Space Force did a whole heck of a lot better, because what does the Space Force do?
Right.
Provides GPS, does conjunction analysis and warning of space debris.
Right.
It was interesting when you brought up that one article in the beginning. It's like, the American people want us to do planetary defense and climate monitoring. Sounds like a Space Coast Guard is necessary.
Sounds like a Space Coast Guard, right? Yeah, yeah.
But well, in the DoD, the money does follow the warfight. This jumpsuit says. Yeah. But, it really didn't back when there was a Department of War and a Department of the Navy. But that's a whole different issue.
Different history conversation.
But, that's sort of how it was. And when we talk about, military missions out on the moon, we would say, hey, look, we're not supposed to necessarily fight China on the moon because they get an interesting spot of land that we want or anything like that.
Right.
There used to be a Navy mission called just sort of presence. We would have ships there just to fly the flag, make sure our
that was the Roosevelt White Fleet. I mean, it went around the world on purpose to just be around. That's all they were trying to do, right? I get the point of that. I'm looking forward to the point where, Space Force has officers in space. Space Force has officers at research centers on the lunar surface. That Space Force has officers at the Lagrange point. I think that's a super important piece that almost nobody wants to talk about. I don't want to name this general because they're still there. But a while ago, I had a conversation pre-Space Force with a 3-star general. And I was trying to talk to him about the moon. And he was super polite for about the first 10 minutes when he was telling me his side of the conversation. But I'm like, well, what about the moon? And it was like the whole conversation was over 17 seconds later. And he's like, this is the world. This is the sphere that I have to monitor. If the moon is part of our sphere of influence, it's impossible. Next topic. And he walked away at that point, right?
And these are the leaders of your Space Force.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this was 2010, and you could start to see some changes, but these folks are still around. They're still around.
No, there are still active duty officers that would say the same thing.
Yeah, yeah.
There are.
So if that's the world we actually are living in, right? Let's forget what we want. We're here now. Brown won. Blue is, it's not even budget dust. I can't see anything, maybe with the exception of some stuff at AFRL that is building space-based solar power. So one piece. But beyond that, this is where we are. So then how do we change the arc of this trajectory to get us anything on the blue side? I'll take any win at this point.
Well, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot to be optimistic about, in my opinion. The most visionary officer in the Space Force, Lieutenant General Shaw, is retiring in September because he was not selected for 4-star.
Right.
That hurts. That everyone else speaks lockstep with everyone else, but we'll see how it goes in the future. There's not a whole lot of really. I don't have a whole lot of hope for the near term. I see the Space Force pretty much doing what Air Force Space Command wanted to do, being led by the Department of the Air Force, who ensured that the Space Force was led by Air Force approved space generals. And I don't think there's enough of an external push that can't be dismissed. I mean, a lot of the things that we talk about, hey, China's going to the moon. Hey, there's a lot of opportunities with Starship, which is probably the real touchstone between brown water and blue water. It's like, is Starship supposed to get you a whole lot of new satellites cheap, or is it supposed to open up the solar system to whatever you want to do? That'll be the blue versus brown water, scratch and sniff test. But there's no reason for the Space Force as it is to change because everyone's happy about it. We can argue that there's a lot of Space Force people that are in no way space professionals because Air Force Space Command didn't develop them to be space professionals that would understand what you do, that will understand what, that will read science fiction without being embarrassed by it.
Right. Yep. Right.
And stuff like that. But it's just not, there's not going to be enough push to change. So there's going to be one of two different things. One, we have enough time for the lieutenants and captains that came up when the Space Force was stood up, and they decided, the top of the Air Force Academy classes and ROTCs around the nation decided to go into the Space Force because it was a new thing and gave up their pilot slots. And that top human capital in the Department of the Air Force Officer Corps went to the Space Force. If there's enough time for these people to hopefully stick through it and become mid-level officers, squadron commanders, and then get into the senior ranks and start to steer the ship because they are just flat out better than their seniors, including me, right?
Yep.
They might be able to change turn the ship. The alternative is that we just plod along and then get strategically surprised by a peer adversary and then get egg on our face, and then everyone gets fired, and maybe the Space Force folds in order for something else to take its place.
Wow, that is dark. That is a dark version.
It's been a dark time.
Yeah. I wasn't considering that Space Force could fold. That one was not on my radar. So I'm going to ponder that one for sure.
Well, let's not. I don't want to get too.
But I get your point, right? That there's some sort of Pearl Harbor in space. We've all been hearing about that term for a long time. That there's enough. I mean, we did see when there was a intelligence failure when the Twin Towers came down. That rejiggered all of government. We have Homeland Security as a result of that. That bad day. So you're saying that if there's a Pearl Harbor in space type situation, that might be enough to shake things up to get a different form of Space Force.
Well, that comes from my own personal belief that space forces, space militaries are supposed to be navies, or they do not understand what their role is.
Right. Yeah.
They cannot understand what their role is. So we have an army focused, an army descendant space Air Force, what we have right now.
Okay, go into that. That needs more explanation. I know what you're talking about. The Air Force came from the Army, Space Force came from the Air Force, but go into that with your history background a little bit.
Well, it's the Air Force again. I think I tried to explain it earlier. The Air Force earned its spurs by bombing. It is long-range artillery. That's what air does. And even though there's rumors that the next chief of staff of the Air Force might be an airlift person, which is interesting, The military, the Air Force is essentially airborne artillery or defending against other airborne artillery. It's a combat organization. The Navy, on the other hand, isn't like that. I want to try to get a little bit historical here and read you a quote from Admiral Mahan's first book, The Influence of Sea Power on History. He claims the necessity of a navy, in the restricted sense of the word, springs from the existence of a peaceful shipping and disappears with it, except in the case of a nation which has aggressive tendencies and keeps up a navy merely as a branch of the military establishment. The military, the Air Force centric Space Force, is a military organization that has no real, it's not doing its Navy role of defending peaceful shipping. It's focused only on keeping itself up as a branch of the joint force, the military establishment. Their only utility that they see themselves as is for the aggressive tendencies of the terrestrial militaries. And to that end, they will exclude everything like defending peaceful shipping. Even a couple of days ago, General Dickinson, the commander of U.S. Space Command, said, "It is not my mission set to defend commercial satellites."
Right.
That's from a Navy perspective, from a maritime perspective, that's ridiculous, because the whole idea of a Navy is to defend the property and lives of your citizens at sea.
Commerce of the nation runs through shipping lanes.
And now we have the Space Foundation saying that the global economy is over $500 billion.
Right. Yeah.
It's right on the wall, and people will not see it because they refuse to see it. And if they refuse to see it, how are you going to be able to change if you need to?
Let's put that in perspective. The entire U.S. economy is roughly $20 trillion. The space economy is $500 billion. So 1/40 of the U.S. economy is space. Now, that's not all ours. That 550 trillion is not, 550 billion is not all U.S., but it is very dominantly U.S. So, Barbie and Oppenheimer had a big weekend this weekend. They made $300 million. This is $550 billion.
And don't just think about the number that it is now, but where the majority of growth and industrial growth is going to come from. And that could very likely come from space. So it's not just the total, but also the rate of change.
Right.
That's my economic development side of me.
Yeah.
That rate of change can be better.
It's 800 billion within 5 years.
Yeah.
So,
and it could go a lot faster if the Space Force was there as a helpmate and a partner to commercial expansion, which is what the Navy did in the 17 and 1800s.
Yep.
So, there's not a whole lot of people that think that way. And honestly, I will, maybe talk out of turn a little bit here, but the Blue Water folks did lose.
Yeah.
But I would say that we lost because the Brownwater side just ran the clock out on us. There is very, very little advanced thinking that is going on in Brownwater circles. They're just not very well, they can't respond to our arguments, and they didn't. And the inertia of the Pentagon said, well, they're the space generals. I guess they're the ones that should be in charge. And, that's not going to do much right now for, the people that are cozy in their positions are going to stay with their opinions that they believe got them where they were.
Mm-hmm.
But there's going to be a fire in the belly of some of the younger folks, because they're either going to get upset and then leave and join commercial space,
which they
or
are.
Stick around and take over.
I have personally counseled 2 junior officers who want to get into the commercial sector. I have done that, right? And I'm kind of not on most people's radars, right? But there was one just before Space Force was announced. and he was thinking about going into the Marine Corps. That was an interesting choice. And then there was another one post Space Force, and they both got out. They both got out, and I know several academy grads that have gotten out of the service in order to go into the commercial sector. The military's, the Air Force in particular, is losing their best and brightest because the ambition doesn't match the pathways that are available to them. So yeah, you're gonna watch the commercial sector, and the commercial sector is going to force Space Force to do stuff.
I hope so.
At $6 billion invested in the commercial space sector last quarter alone, right? Extrapolate that. Quarter one, it was 2 billion. Quarter two, it was 6 billion. There's more on its way. On those numbers, and this is what I said to Dr. Mosier, the chief scientist of U.S. Space Force in 2018. On those numbers, the commercial space sector is larger than the entire Space Force budget. It is coming close to being larger than the entire NASA budget. And it won't surprise me very much if in about 5 or 10 years, it's larger than the combined budget of Space Force and NASA.
And that's how it should be, right?
Yeah.
Because private money is more efficient than government money.
It is.
Not always, but often.
It goes after like specific targets. So, in our last few minutes, we only have about 4 minutes left. Talk, high level about space domain awareness and why anybody, Space Force and all our civilians, should care. I know I just kind of threw a curveball here, but
no.
We talked about some other stuff, but I want people to understand what space SDA is in general.
So as near as I understand, space domain awareness was adapted for maritime domain awareness by General Shaw, who we talked about earlier.
It was Shaw who changed it from
space situational awareness.
Space situational awareness to, yeah.
But SDA is more in that you have to know the actors, you have to know the satellites, you have to know where the money is going, you have to understand everything that's happening in space in order to use it to play on that grand chessboard smartly. Right. So if we're going to talk about space as a new strategic competition area for middle powers, great powers, everybody, you want to know what's going on so you can position yourself the best way on the board and respond to, not necessarily adversaries, but just competitor moves. I am not a war fighting guy. I will fight if necessary, but the competition is far more interesting to me because I think it's far more critical for the long run. And if we're going to be good stewards of space, if we're going to defend American interests in space, if we're going to have great space expansion and the United States take a large share of that economic expansion in space, you have to know what's going on because intelligence is extremely important for everybody. You have to have knowledge. And that knowledge is more than just, hey, I can see this golf ball getting close to the International Space Station. That's important, but it's not the only thing that you need. And really, if you want to talk about SDA, you have to talk that we need a better Space Force intelligence unit to really understand what's going on and, give national leadership the understanding that they need to cooperate and compete in space correctly at the national level. That's just the way it is.
Brilliant. I love the idea of kind of an enhanced Space Force intelligence group. Last comment, just a few weeks ago, General Miley signed an order called the Joint Concept for Competing back in February. I'll post the link here in a second. And it point blank says, point blank, in quotes, what we're doing now isn't working. So with that in mind, my hope is that blue versus brown and some of Miley's comments, some of Miley's, the Joint Chiefs statements in this document might be used as ammunition to swerve our current path kind of more towards the path that we're looking for in the future. So.
Well, not to throw more shade on it, but one, you're absolutely right, and I hope it happens that way. But the joint concept for competing is actually another iteration of something that was another joint concept from a couple of years ago called the competition continuum and other things like that. So the ideas have been out there for a while, but I was hoping that you would actually turn this into a joint publication on competing, but they just rehashed it and they developed it a little bit better, but it's still a joint concept. A joint concept is not quite doctrine. It's just an interesting idea that they're trying to continue to develop before the joint force actually has to act on it. So yes, the joint concept for competing is a great document. They have to make it joint doctrine.
Okay.
And then the Space Force has to realize what they need to do under that new joint doctrine.
I love the idea of, I've been really impressed with the Defense Innovation Unit. Some of the stuff that's coming out of SBIR, STTR programs, but as long as Air Force is ultimately in charge of SBIR, STTR for Space Force ops, you're going to just keep getting different bombers. You're not going to build the things we want to build. All right, sir. Fantastic, Dr. Ziarnick. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Fascinating insights, terrific wisdom. Thanks so much. Good luck in your new post. I think your new role. I think that's going to be really cool for the officers coming in for your program.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was a pleasure being on. Thanks again.
Right on.
Take care.